The mother of a billionaire was dying slowly, not suddenly, not in a loud, tragic way. It was just one chemotherapy session after another, quietly draining the strength from her body, until even walking across a parking lot became too much. Every Thursday afternoon, an elderly woman named Evelyn Whitmore would step out of the cancer treatment center in downtown Chicago and stand huddled in the cold wind, waiting for a rideshare that often never came. Drivers kept canceling the ride as soon as they read the pickup note. Elderly chemotherapy patient. Long distance. May require a long wait. They didn't want a sick person vomiting in their car. They didn't want to waste time. They didn't want the hospital smell sticking to the car they used to support their family. But there was one woman who always accepted the ride. Every single week. Lena Morales, 34 years old, widowed, exhausted, driving a 2012 Toyota Camry with a half-broken heater and a gas light that was almost always on. On the first evening Evelyn got into Lena's car, the old woman vomited in the back seat halfway through the ride and immediately apologized over and over like a child who had just ruined something very expensive. Lena simply pulled into a gas station under the flickering yellow lights, took an old towel from the trunk to clean the seat, and gently said, "Seats can be cleaned. But a person shouldn't have to feel ashamed for being in pain." Evelyn didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride. She just sat quietly watching the woman in the driver's seat, as if it had been a very long time since anyone had spoken to her with genuine patience. And over the next 52 Thursdays, Lena Morales would drive her old car to take the same elderly woman to chemotherapy without ever knowing that she was the mother of one of the most powerful billionaires in America. Lena Morales lived in a small rented apartment above an old grocery store in the back of the Yards neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where the walls were so thin she could hear the couple next door arguing every night and the sound of freight trains echoing through the window near dawn. The apartment had only 2 small rooms with peeling paint around the kitchen doorframe, but it was the only place she could still afford after her husband died in a workplace accident at a construction site 3 years earlier. The day they called Lena from Cook County Hospital to say the scaffolding had collapsed on the floor where Daniel was working, Sophia was only 5 years old and still thought her father would come home to read her a story before bedtime like every other night. Lena had never truly gotten over that day. She had only learned to keep moving after it the way people walk with a broken bone that never fully heals. Before that, Lena had worked as a CNA at a nursing home in Cicero. The job was grueling, low-paying, and almost no one noticed them except when they needed bed sheets changed or vomit cleaned up from patients. But Lena loved the elderly people there. She liked sitting and listening to their repeated stories about war, about 50-year marriages, about children who were too busy to call. But after Daniel died, she couldn't continue working the 12-hour night shifts anymore, because Sophia started having panic attacks every time she woke up and didn't see her mother. Lena quit and started driving for Uber and Lyft with the 2012 Toyota Camry she bought on payments from an old garage on Archer Avenue. The car had over 200,000 miles, the passenger side window sometimes wouldn't roll up, and the heater only worked sporadically like a cranky old person. But it was the only thing standing between her and losing the apartment. During the day, Lena barely got enough sleep. She snatched a few hours while Sophia was at school and then drove late into the night to cover rent, electricity, her daughter's asthma medication, and the monthly car payment. There were nights Lena drove for 14 straight hours to the point her wrists ached every time she turned the steering wheel, but she kept going because there was no other choice. Every morning before school, Sophia would often fall asleep in the back seat with her pink jacket rolled up as a pillow while Lena tried to take a few last rides around downtown Chicago. Sometimes Lena would look at her daughter in the rearview mirror and feel a quiet guilt tightening around her chest. An 8-year-old child shouldn't have to grow up in the back seat of an old Camry. But Sophia never complained. The little girl would just rub her eyes and ask her mother if they had enough money to buy cereal today. Lena had a habit that many other drivers hated most. She always accepted medical transport rides, trips from hospitals, from chemotherapy centers, from dialysis clinics, rides that risked vomiting in the car, long waits, and usually very little tip. Other drivers avoided them like trouble. Lena didn't. Every time she saw a pickup note that said elderly passenger or cancer treatment, she remembered her own father. He had spent his final months in a crowded nursing facility in the suburbs of Chicago after his second stroke. Lena still remembered the last time she visited him at the end of a night shift. He was sitting alone by the window, with a tray of cold food in front of him, because no one had time to sit and help him eat. When Lena asked why he didn't press the call button for the nurse, her father just smiled tiredly and said everyone there was too busy. He died 2 weeks later. What haunted Lena wasn't her father's death, but the loneliness in his eyes on the last day she saw him. From that day on, she could never stand the sight of an elderly person struggling with illness alone. That was why she still accepted hospital rides, even when they cost her time and money. After the first evening she drove Evelyn Whitmore home, Lena began to notice something strange. Every Thursday morning, right around the time she went online on the app, there would be a pickup request from the same cancer treatment center in downtown. Same name, Evelyn. Same destination, in Gold Coast. At first, Lena thought it was a coincidence, but by the third week, she began to understand that the old woman was deliberately trying to find her. Evelyn always wore an old navy blue sweater with loose silver buttons at the wrists, and always held a small white vomit bag on her lap like someone who had become too familiar with chemotherapy. She walked very slowly after each treatment, but always tried to stand straight, as if she didn't want anyone to see her weakness. One time Lena arrived a few minutes early and looked through the glass door of the treatment center. She saw Evelyn sitting alone under the cold white lights with a knitted scarf wrapped around her head while all the other patients had family members with them. The image immediately reminded Lena of her father. From then on, she started doing something she couldn't even explain to herself. Instead of dropping Evelyn off and continuing to take other rides to make money, Lena began waiting outside the treatment center for hours every Thursday. She would park in the parking garage, eat a cheap sandwich from the gas station, and nap for a few minutes between rides, just so that when Evelyn came out after chemotherapy, she wouldn't have to stand waiting in the cold wind for even one more second. Evelyn always told Lena she didn't need to do that. Lena simply replied that Chicago was cold enough already, and no one should have to stand alone after chemotherapy. Sophia gradually got used to Evelyn, the way children always get used to kind people. The little girl started leaving snacks in the car for her every week. Sometimes a small pack of crackers. Sometimes a drawing of 3 people sitting in a silver car under the snow. Evelyn would hold those drawings for a long time, as if they were the most precious things she had ever received. One afternoon, Lena heard Sophia ask Evelyn if chemotherapy hurt. Evelyn was silent for a few seconds, and then answered that the most painful thing wasn't the medicine, but having to return to a very quiet apartment after treatment ended. From that day on, Sophia always tried to talk more whenever Evelyn got in the car. Even though life was so difficult that sometimes Lena had to count every penny to buy gas, she never charged Evelyn extra for waiting time. She knew that after chemotherapy, the old woman was usually too exhausted to walk fast or manage on her own like a normal person. One time, Lena saw Evelyn trying to dig through her wallet to give extra tip money, and her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped her credit card on the car floor. Lena picked it up, placed it back in the old woman's hand, and gently said to save the money for hot soup after chemotherapy. Evelyn looked at her for a very long time after that remark. Chicago entered its coldest winter of the year, right when the heat in the Camry started breaking down completely. There were mornings when Sophia's breath formed white clouds in the car even before the engine warmed up. Lena had to buy small heating packs at Walgreens and tuck them under blankets for Sophia and Evelyn on the long trips to the treatment center. One time the snow fell so heavily that the wipers could barely work, but Lena still drove through Lakeshore Drive to pick up Evelyn on time for her chemotherapy. She never told the old woman that her bank account at that moment had less than $40. She also never told her that she had started skipping dinner so Sophia could have more milk and asthma inhaler medication. Then on a Wednesday night at the end of January, Lena opened the mailbox in front of her apartment and saw a yellow notice slipped under the electricity bill. Rent past due. If not paid within 10 days, she and Sophia would be evicted. Lena stood for a long time in the freezing hallway with the paper trembling in her hand while the sound of TVs from other apartments echoed behind closed doors. The next morning was Thursday. Lena woke up at 5 o'clock, put 2 extra layers of jackets on Sophia, started the old Camry under the snow, and still drove to the cancer treatment center in downtown Chicago on time like every previous week without complaining once. While Lena Morales was trying to figure out if her bank account still had enough money for gas for the weekend, nearly 10 miles to the north, Evelyn Whitmore was standing on the stage of a technology conference in downtown Chicago in an expensive gray suit under bright white lights and the prolonged applause of hundreds of investors. His face appeared on the giant LED screen behind the stage next to the words "Human-Centered Innovation." The host called Adrian one of the most important minds in modern logistics. The man who had built Whitmore Dynamics from a small startup into a billion-dollar AI transportation corporation with automated warehouses spanning the entire United States. CNBC constantly invited him to talk about the future of supply chains. Forbes had once put Adrian on the cover with the headline, "The Man Rebuilding American Logistics." He owned a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan with floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a private Gulf Stream always ready at Midway Airport, and a team of assistants working nearly 24 hours a day to manage every meeting, every dinner, every flight. There were weeks when Adrian would wake up in Chicago, have lunch in New York, and end the day with a meeting with partners in San Francisco, while barely remembering which city he had been in that morning. But even though he could buy almost anything in the world, Adrian Whitmore still could not make his mother feel less lonely in her final days. Evelyn Whitmore had lived alone in a luxurious condo in the Gold Coast since her husband died more than 10 years earlier from heart failure. The apartment was nearly 3,000 square feet with dark wood floors, old oil paintings, and a balcony overlooking the grayish Michigan Lake every winter. But most of the time the place was so quiet that Evelyn could clearly hear the wall clock in the living room at midnight. Adrian had tried to do everything the way he understood was right. He hired private nurses, he hired a personal chauffeur, he paid for a concierge medical service that could schedule appointments with any top doctor in the city with just one phone call. He even had his assistant arrange a private chef to cook meals suitable for cancer patients. But Evelyn refused almost everything. She hated the feeling that everyone who entered the apartment looked at her like a medical case file to be handled. The nurses always spoke in overly soft voices, as if she were about to shatter. The private drivers always opened the car door with perfect politeness, but their eyes kept glancing at the clock. The concierge medical service called to check on her condition the way people tracked the progress of a major project. Evelyn didn't want to become a project to be managed. She was just an old woman who was terrified because her body was slowly betraying her. But Adrian didn't understand that. In his mind, paying all the medical bills meant he had fulfilled his duty as a son. He had never let his mother worry about money for even one day. The best chemotherapy, the best doctors, the best private room. Adrian believed that love could be proven by not letting the person he loved lack anything. And in a way, he truly loved his mother. It was just that Adrian's love was always divided between board meetings, long business trips, and hundreds of unread emails. His calls to Evelyn usually happened at the airport or in a car on the way to a television interview. "Is Mom okay?" he would ask quickly. "I'll stop by this weekend if I'm not flying to Seattle." Then a few minutes later, the call would end because an assistant came to remind him that a meeting was about to start. Evelyn had never blamed her son. She knew Adrian had worked almost his whole life to build his own empire after his father died. But there were evenings when she sat alone on the sofa, watching the snow fall outside the window, and realized no one had sat with her for longer than 15 minutes in many weeks. Adrian had no idea that his mother was quietly using rideshares to go to chemotherapy every Thursday morning. Evelyn deliberately hid it because she didn't want another argument about chauffeurs or private transport. More importantly, she didn't want to lose those car rides with Lena Morales. While Adrian stood on stage talking about how technology needed to put people at the center, a few streets away his mother was sitting shivering in the old Toyota Camry with the heater making a weak rattling sound in the middle of a Chicago snowstorm. While Adrian received applause from investors, Lena Morales was pulling an old blanket over Evelyn's legs and handing her a bag of anti-nausea crackers bought at Walgreens with the last money in her wallet. One time Evelyn sat in Lena's car watching the snowflakes hit the window and suddenly realized she had begun to look forward to these rides more than finishing chemotherapy, not because the hospital was more comfortable, not because the car was more comfortable, but because it was the only time in the week when someone asked what music she wanted to listen to on the way home. It was the only time someone looked at her like a person instead of a responsibility. Lena never spoke to Evelyn in a pitying voice. She didn't try to act noble. She didn't call her poor thing, like some nurses did. She just talked normally about the Chicago weather, about Sophia's spelling test, or about how people always made the coffee too bitter at the hospital. And in some way, those small things made Evelyn feel like she still belonged to the world of the living, rather than someone who was quietly disappearing. One afternoon after chemotherapy, Lena drove along Lakeshore Drive while the winter sky turned into a deep gray like cold steel. Evelyn sat in the front seat with her navy blue knitted scarf wrapped around her head and looked out at Lake Michigan for a long time before quietly saying that sometimes money only gave people more rooms in which to feel lonely. Lena didn't answer right away. She just tightened her grip slightly on the steering wheel while the old Camry continued rolling through the city, sinking into the darkness of a Chicago winter. Then the Thursdays began to repeat in the strangest way. In a big cold city like Chicago, two complete strangers had accidentally become a fixed part of each other's lives. Every Thursday morning, right around 8:15, Lena Morales' phone would light up with a pickup request from the Cancer Treatment Center in downtown. And every time, Lena would reach for the thermos of ginger tea she had prepared the night before and place it in the holder next to the gear shift like a habit that had formed so naturally she no longer noticed it. At first, she only brought tea because Evelyn often felt nauseous after chemotherapy, but it gradually became something that was always in the car whenever the old woman sat in the front seat. Lena also bought cheap salted crackers at Walgreens because she remembered a nurse once saying light salty snacks could help patients feel better after treatment. There were days when the money in Lena's wallet was only enough for gas and Sophia asthma medicine, but she still spent a few extra dollars on a new box of crackers if she saw the old one was almost empty. Evelyn started sitting in the front seat instead of the back around the 5th week. No one said why. One morning, she simply opened the passenger door and sat down next to Lena as if it were the most natural thing in the world. From then on, the rides no longer felt like a ride, but like two people trying to help each other get through the winter with small conversations. Sophia would often fall asleep on her mother's shoulder while Lena waited for hours outside the treatment center. Some days it was so cold that the car windows were covered with condensation from their breath, and Lena had to turn the engine on for a few minutes at a time to keep warm and then turn it off again for fear of burning too much gas. While Sophia slept curled up under the old blanket in the back seat, Lena would often look at the bright red surge pricing on her phone screen. There were times she could make 3 times the money just by taking a few rides around downtown after rush hour. But then the door of the treatment center would open, and she would imagine Evelyn standing alone in the cold wind, holding the vomit bag to her chest, while other drivers kept canceling. And every time, Lena would close the app and keep waiting. One time, Evelyn came out nearly 2 hours late because of a medication reaction that required her to stay for additional monitoring. When she saw the old Camry still parked under the lights of the parking garage, she stood still for a very long time, as if she couldn't believe Lena had really waited for her the whole time. "You could have taken 10 other rides," Evelyn said in a tired voice. Lena just shrugged. "I don't like leaving old people standing outside." After a few weeks, Evelyn began to talk more about her life before illness made every day feel the same. She had taught literature at Evanston for nearly 30 years. She told stories about students who once hated Shakespeare and then cried when reading King Lear in their senior year. She told about the time she took the whole class to see a play in Chicago in winter, and the old school bus had a broken heater halfway there, forcing everyone to wrap themselves in blankets and laugh for 2 hours. There were moments when Evelyn spoke in a very different voice, stronger, sharper, to the point that Lena almost forgot the woman sitting next to her was a cancer patient who had to hold a vomit bag every week. Gradually, Lena began to understand that before illness took the strength from her legs and made her hands shake after every chemotherapy session, Evelyn Whitmore had once been the kind of woman who could make an entire room fall silent to listen. One time they were stuck in traffic for nearly 40 minutes on Lakeshore Drive because of a snowstorm. Sophia had fallen asleep in the back seat while the radio played a quiet old jazz song. Evelyn looked at the swirling snowflakes outside the window and suddenly asked Lena if she ever felt tired from having to be strong for such a long time. Lena smiled faintly, but didn't answer right away. In the end, she only said that when someone else needs you, you usually don't have time to think about how tired you are anymore. Evelyn turned to look out at Lake Michigan for a long time after that remark. One late February afternoon, chemotherapy left Evelyn more exhausted than usual. As soon as she got in the car, she almost immediately fell asleep with her navy blue knitted scarf slightly crooked on her head and her hand still tightly holding the box of crackers Sophia had given her that morning. Lena glanced at her from the corner of her eye and slowed down more than usual, even though there were a few cars behind honking impatiently. She drove slowly through the snow-covered streets of Chicago, as if going gently enough would let the elderly woman beside her rest a few more minutes before having to return to her quiet apartment. Sophia was still sleeping in the back seat, and the golden lights from the shops reflected faintly on the windshield. In that moment, the old worn-out Toyota Camry, with its rattling heater, suddenly felt more like a small shelter in the middle of the freezing city than a rideshare car. And for the first time in many months, Lena Morales realized she had begun to look forward to Thursdays, just like Evelyn Whitmore. As the end of winter approached, Evelyn Whitmore began to talk more about things she had never mentioned in the first few weeks. Not about the hospital, or medicine, or the pain after chemotherapy, but about the feeling of becoming invisible as one grew old. One afternoon when the Chicago sky was so cold that the distant Lake Michigan looked like a sheet of frozen gray metal, Evelyn sat in Lena's car with her navy blue knitted scarf wrapped around her head and suddenly asked if Lena knew what the scariest thing about old age was. Lena thought she would talk about cancer, about pain, about death. But Evelyn only looked at the traffic outside the window and said very softly that the scariest thing was the feeling of gradually disappearing from everyone's life while still being alive. She said that after the age of 70, people started talking about her right in front of her as if she no longer existed in the room. Doctors talked to Adrian instead of asking her directly how she felt. Nurses explained the medicine in overly patient voices as if speaking to a child. Even at restaurants, waiters would often look at her son to ask what she wanted to eat, even though Evelyn was the one holding the menu. "It's like they've already decided that you're not really here anymore," she said, and smiled very faintly. But there was something in that smile that made Lena's chest ache. Lena was silent for a few seconds before telling her that her father had once cried in the nursing home just because no one had enough time to sit and eat with him. It was one evening when Lena got off work late and stopped by the nursing home with a box of chicken soup from the convenience store. She found her father sitting in front of a nearly full tray of food because his hands shook so badly that he couldn't hold the spoon for long. When Lena asked why he didn't ask the nurse for help, her father just shook his head and said everyone was too busy with patients who were more important. That night, he had cried like a child just because someone sat with him long enough to finish the entire dinner. Lena had never forgotten that image. Perhaps that was why every time she saw Evelyn step out of the treatment center, holding the vomit bag to her chest, she felt like she was seeing her father in his final months. Evelyn turned to look at Lena for a very long time after that story, and then suddenly said that Lena was the first person in many months who looked straight into her eyes when talking. Not the pitying look of nurses, not the hurried look of rideshare drivers who wanted to finish the trip as quickly as possible, just the normal look of one person listening to another person. Lena didn't know how to respond, so she only tightened her grip slightly on the steering wheel while the snow began to cover the front windshield white. In the days that followed, Sophia began to become a small but important part of the Thursday rides. The little girl would often sit in the back coloring or doing homework while Lena waited for Evelyn to finish chemotherapy. One afternoon, Sophia spent nearly an hour scribbling something and then shyly handed it to Evelyn when she got in the car. It was a crayon drawing of 3 people standing next to a silver car under the snow. Sophia drew Lena in the middle, herself on the left, and Evelyn on the right with a green scarf on her head. Above all 3 was a misspelled line in childish handwriting. Thursday family. Evelyn held the drawing with her 2 trembling hands and was silent for so long that Sophia thought she didn't like it. But a few seconds later, Evelyn turned her face toward the window, as if trying to hide something, and asked very softly if she could keep this drawing. Sophia nodded immediately. On the way home that day, Evelyn barely said anything else. She only placed the drawing carefully on her lap like something fragile, and occasionally stroked the edge of the paper with her fingertips. Lena glanced over and suddenly realized that cancer wasn't the only thing eating away at Evelyn. Loneliness was what made her more tired than anything else. A week later, chemotherapy left Evelyn in more pain than usual. As soon as she stepped into the car, she had to bend over because of nausea and was shaking so badly she couldn't fasten her seatbelt herself. Lena immediately leaned over to help her without saying a word. Throughout the entire drive along Lakeshore Drive, Evelyn kept her eyes almost closed. Her fingers gripped the navy blue knitted scarf so tightly that her knuckles turned white under her wrinkled skin. Lena turned the radio down and drove slower than usual, as if going gently enough would make the old woman beside her hurt a little less. When the car stopped in front of the condo in Gold Coast, Evelyn tried to open the door, but the pain hit again and made her freeze in the seat. Lena instinctively placed her hand on the old woman's shoulder, and for the first time since they met, Evelyn Whitmore grabbed Lena Morales' hand tightly. Not a polite handshake between passenger and driver, but the kind of grip from a person trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth while feeling herself gradually disappearing from the world. Chicago entered the deepest cold spell of winter in early February, when temperatures dropped to the point where even breathing made the lungs burn with every inhale. Winds from Lake Michigan whipped through the streets like knives, and the old snow froze into dirty gray patches of ice under pedestrians' feet. That was also when Lena Morales' old Toyota Camry started constantly dying. At first, it was just a few hard starts in the morning. Then the heater almost stopped working completely. Then the brakes started making a screeching sound every time Lena stopped at a red light. One night around 3 in the morning, the car died right in the parking lot outside a convenience store in Bronzeville, while Sophia was curled up sleeping in the back seat under 2 blankets. Lena sat frozen behind the wheel, turning the key over and over, while the battery light flashed bright red on the dashboard. She knew if this car broke down completely, everything would collapse immediately. No car meant no income. No income meant losing the apartment. And losing the apartment meant Sophia would have nowhere to sleep except the back seat of a car that wouldn't even start. The next morning, Lena had towed the car to a small garage on Archer Avenue and stand listening to the mechanic explain that she needed a new battery and the entire brake system fixed before the Camry became a real danger on the road. The total cost nearly wiped out the last money she had saved for next month's rent. Lena stood outside the garage for a long time with both hands hidden in the pockets of her thin jacket, while snow swirled around the cars covered in road salt. In the end, she still swiped her card to pay, not because she had enough money, but because she had no other choice. In the days that followed, Lena started working even more. There were days she drove nearly 16 hours straight, and then collapsed on the sofa with her shoes still on. But her body began to rebel. One night near dawn, Sophia had a severe asthma attack after coming home from school, with her cheeks flushed red from the cold. Lena woke up when she heard her daughter struggling to breathe in the darkness of the small apartment. She frantically pulled Sophia up and drove to the nearest urgent care, while her hands shook on the steering wheel from fear. They sat for nearly 3 hours under the cold white lights of the hospital waiting room, before the doctor said the asthma attack had stabilized. When she brought Sophia home, it was almost morning, and Lena could barely keep her eyes open anymore. But that day was Thursday. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, her phone lit up with the familiar pickup request from the Cancer Treatment Center in downtown Chicago. Lena looked at the dark circles under her own eyes in the rearview mirror and still started the car. When Evelyn Whitmore got into the passenger seat that morning, she immediately noticed something was wrong. Lena's hands trembled slightly every time she shifted gears, and under the thin layer of makeup was pale skin from prolonged lack of sleep. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked softly. Lena smiled reflexively like she always did with every passenger and said she was just a little tired from the weather. But Evelyn had lived nearly 80 years. She knew that kind of tiredness didn't come from the weather. On the way home after chemotherapy, Evelyn barely said much. She only occasionally looked at Lena with a very long gaze and then turned to the window. When the car stopped in front of the condo in Gold Coast, She slowly got out as usual and quietly said thank you before closing the door. Lena waited until she entered the lobby and then bent down to pick up the scarf Sophia had dropped under the passenger seat. It was then that she saw a white envelope discreetly tucked between the two front seats. Without opening it, Lena knew there was money inside. A lot of money. She sat still for a few seconds with the envelope in her hand, while the old heater made a weak rattling sound and snow continued to cover the windshield. Part of her wanted to keep it. The rent was past due. Sophia's asthma medicine was about to run out. The bank account was almost empty. But in the end, Lena only sighed and stepped out of the car holding the envelope. Evelyn hadn't yet reached the elevator when Lena called her back in the middle of the shiny condo lobby that smelled of expensive perfume. Lena held the envelope out toward Evelyn and shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything," she said. Evelyn tried to protest, but Lena only smiled tiredly. "I didn't help you to get money in return." In that moment, Evelyn Whitmore stood still as if she didn't know what to do with kindness that came without conditions. She had lived too long in a world where everything had an exchange value. People were kind out of duty. People showed up for salary and bonuses. People took care because of contracts. But the young woman, standing in front of her in the cold condo lobby, was refusing money that could help her pay the rent simply because she didn't want to turn caring into a transaction. Evelyn took the envelope back with her trembling hands and turned away very quickly as if she didn't want Lena to see what was on her face. But when the elevator door closed, Lena still caught sight of the tears quietly running down the elderly woman's cheeks. And for the first time in many years, Evelyn Whitmore cried, not because of cancer, not because of pain, but because it had been too long since anyone had been kind to her without expecting anything in return. Adrian Whitmore began to suspect something was wrong one Monday morning when his personal assistant, Claire, walked into the glass conference room on the 48th floor of Whitmore Dynamics headquarters with an iPad in her hand and a rare, hesitant expression. Adrian barely looked up from his laptop screen when she said that his mother had refused the private chauffeur again the previous week. "The sixth time this month," Claire said softly, as if she didn't want to disrupt his packed schedule. Adrian frowned slightly and continued electronically signing some financial documents in front of him. In his mind, it was just one of the many signs of an old person's stubbornness. Evelyn Whitmore had always hated others controlling her schedule since her husband died. She had once refused even a private chef just because she didn't like having someone standing in her kitchen at 6 in the morning. But what Adrian didn't understand was why his mother preferred calling rideshares instead of using the Mercedes with a private driver, always waiting in the garage. He had hired an older, polite chauffeur specially trained to assist chemotherapy patients. The car was always warmed up 10 minutes before every winter morning. In Adrian's mind, there was no reason why a nearly 80-year-old woman undergoing cancer treatment would choose to sit in a stranger's car instead of a much safer and more comfortable private service. She said she didn't want to trouble the driver by making him wait for hours at the hospital. Claire explained further. Adrian let out a short, humorless laugh. "I pay him to wait." Then he continued his meeting with the investment group from Boston, as if it wasn't worth thinking about any further. But that evening, while sitting alone in his penthouse, looking at the Chicago lights reflecting on the dark surface of Lake Michigan outside the window, Adrian suddenly remembered Claire's words. There was something about the way his mother kept refusing the services he arranged for her that made him uneasy. Not out of anger, but because for the first time, he realized he had no idea what his mother's real life was like when he wasn't there. Adrian opened the family financial management app and began reviewing recent payment history. Among the long list of medical bills and concierge service fees, he noticed the same rideshare account appearing repeatedly every Thursday morning. Same pickup area, same time frame, same route from the treatment center to Gold Coast. Adrian stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because he was worried his mother was in danger, but because he suddenly felt like a stranger to her life. He knew his company's stock price by the minute. He knew the exact operating schedule of the warehouses in Arizona. He knew which partners were negotiating new contracts. But he didn't know who was taking his mother home after each chemotherapy session. That thought made Adrian feel a nagging discomfort under his chest that he tried to push away by going back to work. A few days later, Adrian flew to New York for a meeting with major Whitmore Dynamics investors in Manhattan. He stood in the glass-walled conference room, looking down at the traffic jammed under the snow, speaking about the future of AI in supply chains with the calm voice of an experienced CEO. The investors nodded as Adrian said that technology only mattered if it served people in a more humane way. At that exact moment, nearly 800 miles away, Evelyn Whitmore was doubled over in the freezing parking garage behind the Chicago Treatment Center because of severe nausea after treatment. Lina Morales knelt beside her on the ice-cold concrete, one hand holding the old woman's hair back from her face, the other holding the trembling vomit bag to her mouth. Sophia sat in the car watching through the window with worried eyes while snow continued to swirl white around the garage light poles. Evelyn vomited until she could barely breathe and kept apologizing between dry heaves as if she had just caused a terrible inconvenience to someone. Lina just quietly held her shoulder and said it was okay to take it slow, that she was right there. No television cameras, no team of assistants, no speech about humanity. Just one exhausted woman taking care of one elderly woman in pain in the freezing hospital parking garage. While Adrian shook hands with investors and went to an elegant dinner in Midtown Manhattan, his mother was trembling against the old Camry with red eyes from chemotherapy. And for the first time in many years, the distance between Adrian Whitmore's world and the reality of his mother's life began to appear so clearly that he could no longer pretend not to see it. The snowstorm hit Chicago in mid-February so fast that the weather reports hadn't even had time to update the real level of danger. Winds from Lake Michigan whipped hard through the high-rises, turning snow into thick white columns between the streets, and temperatures dropped so low that people were advised not to go outside unless absolutely necessary. Within just a few hours, the rideshare app began showing red alerts about long wait times and a shortage of active drivers in the area. Many people closed the app and went home before the roads froze completely. Those who remained kept canceling long trips or hospital pickups because no one wanted to get stuck for hours in a snowstorm with a passenger who might need medical assistance. That afternoon, Evelyn Whitmore sat alone under the cold white lights of the downtown Chicago Cancer Treatment Center while her phone kept showing notifications. Your driver has canceled the ride. One after another. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. Then 30 minutes. Outside the glass door, snow had covered the curbside pickup area so thickly that the road was almost invisible. Most patients had already been picked up by family long ago. Nurses began cleaning the reception desk and preparing to close the treatment area early because of the weather. Evelyn pulled her navy blue knitted scarf tighter around her neck and tried to stand up again to look outside, but her legs had almost no strength left after chemotherapy. A young nurse offered to call ambulance transport, but Evelyn immediately refused because she didn't want to cause more trouble. The real reason was that she was still waiting for Lina Morales' old silver Camry to appear in the snow. Meanwhile, about 40 minutes drive from the hospital, Lina was struggling to keep the Toyota Camry in the right lane on the road covered with snow and ice near the south side. The wipers could barely keep up with the thick snow constantly hitting the windshield, and the heater made a weak rattling sound, as if it was about to give up too. Sophia was asleep in the back seat under two blankets, while Lina had to lean close to the steering wheel to see the road ahead clearly. The rideshare app kept showing bright red surge pricing all over downtown Chicago. If she wanted, Lina could make 4 times the money just by taking short rides around the loop. But then her phone lit up with the familiar name. Evelyn Whitmore. Pickup waiting too long. Lina didn't think for another second. She turned the car toward the hospital, while the wind was so strong that the entire Camry shook on the road. When Lina finally reached the parking garage behind the treatment center, the clock was nearly 7 in the evening, and most of the lights in the building had been turned off. Evelyn was standing near the exit door with both arms wrapped tightly around herself, so small she almost blended in the gray of the snow and darkness. As soon as she tried to step down from the curb, her legs gave out from exhaustion. Lina jumped out of the car almost immediately and ran through the snow that reached her ankles. "Take it slow," she said softly while holding Evelyn's trembling arm. But after just a few steps, Lina realized the old woman could barely walk anymore. Chemotherapy had taken every last bit of strength from her body. Without another word, Lena bent down and carried Evelyn on her back, as if she were much lighter than her age and all the painful months she had carried. Evelyn burst into tears almost immediately. Not loud crying, just small choked sobs mixed with the howling wind in the snow-covered parking garage. Lena carefully placed her in the passenger seat and pulled the door closed so the little bit of warmth in the car wouldn't escape. Sophia woke up when she heard the car door slam shut. The little girl rubbed her eyes for a few seconds and immediately saw Evelyn's legs shaking from the cold under the thin pants of a chemotherapy patient. Without being told, Sophia took off her own pink-knitted scarf and leaned over to carefully wrap it around Evelyn's legs. "You'll be warmer," the little girl said softly in a sleepy voice. Evelyn looked down at the scarf and covered her mouth with her hand, as if trying to stop herself from crying again. Lena quietly fastened the seatbelt for her and began driving away from the hospital through the thick white snow. Throughout the entire drive along Lakeshore Drive, the old heater kept rattling, and the weak warm air was only enough to melt part of the fog on the windshield. Outside, Chicago had almost disappeared under the snowstorm. The faint yellow streetlights appeared and faded behind each fierce swirling layer of snow. Evelyn huddled in the passenger seat with Sophia's pink scarf wrapped around her legs and her hands still trembling slightly from the cold and pain. Then suddenly, she cried for real. "Since my husband died," she said brokenly between trembling breaths, "I haven't felt like anyone has taken care of me like this anymore." Lena didn't know how to respond. She only continued driving very slowly through the thick snow while her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly from the cold and exhaustion. Sophia had fallen back asleep in the back seat. The old heater kept rattling in the darkness of a Chicago winter. And for the first time in many years, Evelyn Whitmore no longer felt like she was fighting her illness alone. The mother of a billionaire was dying slowly. Previous part already translated. After that snowstorm, something changed between Sophia and Evelyn in a very natural way that neither of them deliberately created. If in the beginning Sophia only saw Evelyn as an old lady who often rode with her mom, now every Thursday morning had become a special day for the little girl. There were weeks when Sophia would wake up, even before the alarm clock, and immediately ask if today was the day to see Miss Evelyn. Lena would often laugh at that excitement, but deep down she knew the reason. Children always recognize people who make them feel safe, and Evelyn, even while fighting cancer, still had a very special gentleness that Sophia loved. Since she found out Sophia liked reading books from the school library, Evelyn began telling the little girl stories she had used to teach students for decades in Evanston. Not long lectures like in class, just small stories told in a slow voice during the long rides from the treatment center back to Gold Coast. She told her about the red-haired girl, Anne Shirley in Green Gables, about Tom Sawyer and his adventures along the Mississippi, about the characters she had loved when she was a young teacher. Sophia sat in the back seat listening attentively, as if every story opened up a whole new world. Sometimes the little girl would even ask Evelyn to continue the story the following week if it hadn't ended yet. Evelyn would always smile and promise to remember. Before long, Sophia started calling her Miss Evelyn with the completely natural affection of a child. Not Mom, not Mrs. Whitmore, just Miss Evelyn. Every time she heard Sophia call her that, Evelyn would smile in a very different way. A softer smile, younger, almost like the smile of the woman in those old photos she had once shown Lena. One time Lena saw Evelyn open her wallet and take out the drawing Sophia had made many weeks earlier. The edges of the paper were slightly wrinkled from being opened and looked at so many times. She looked at it for a few seconds before carefully putting it back in her wallet like a treasure. Lena didn't say anything, but she understood what it meant. In the many months that had passed, the luxurious condo in Gold Coast might be filled with expensive furniture, but there probably wasn't anything that made Evelyn feel as loved as a sheet of paper drawn with crayons by an 8-year-old girl. Gradually, Evelyn didn't just tell stories to Sophia. She also started asking about school, about friends, about spelling tests, and the library books the little girl was reading. There were times when Lena listened to them talking and unconsciously forgot that Evelyn wasn't Sophia's biological grandmother. Sometimes she even felt they understood each other better than many blood relatives. The strangest thing was that whenever Sophia was in the car, Evelyn seemed healthier. She smiled more. She talked more. Even the most difficult chemotherapy days seemed a little more bearable with the sound of the little girl's chatter from the back seat. Lena began to notice this after a few weeks. On the days when Sophia had to stay at school for after-school activities and didn't come along, Evelyn was noticeably quieter. But on the days Sophia was there, she almost always told stories or laughed at least a few times on the way home. One late February afternoon, chemotherapy left Evelyn more exhausted than usual. The snow had stopped falling, but the Chicago sky was still covered in the characteristic cold gray of winter. Sophia sat in the back with a library book in her hands. Evelyn had just gotten in the car and was so tired she didn't have the strength to talk. Lena thought she would fall asleep immediately, but Sophia still opened the book and began reading aloud a chapter from a children's short story. The little girl's reading was still slow, and she stumbled over a few difficult words, but Evelyn listened attentively. Then about 10 minutes later, Sophia's steady reading voice, mixed with the sound of the old engine and the rattling heater, made Evelyn gradually drift off. When Lena looked in the rearview mirror, she saw Evelyn's head slightly tilted to one side, her eyes closed, and her hand still holding the book Sophia had just given her. Sophia continued reading more softly, as if afraid of waking her. Outside the window, Chicago passed by in the silvery late afternoon light. Inside the car, there was only the sound of a child reading and the faint warmth from the old heater. Lena looked at the scene for a few more seconds and unconsciously felt something very strange. For the first time in many years, the old Toyota Camry that she had always seen as a tool for making a living no longer felt like a rideshare car. It felt like a small moving home in the middle of the freezing city, a place where three lonely people had accidentally found each other and shared the last bit of warmth left in their lives. Winter still showed no signs of ending when the biggest difficulty yet finally came to Lena Morales in the form of a yellow piece of paper slipped under the apartment door. She saw it one late evening after finishing a nearly 15-hour driving shift. At first, Lena thought it was just an electricity bill or a building maintenance notice. But as soon as she read the first line, she felt her stomach tighten. An order of eviction, warning of eviction. Rent had been past due for nearly 2 months. Lena stood motionless in the narrow, freezing hallway of the old apartment building, while Sophia was sleeping on her shoulder. The numbers printed on the paper seemed to blur before her eyes. She knew this would happen sooner or later. After replacing the battery, fixing the brakes, and paying Sophia's medical bills, she had constantly had to choose between paying one bill or letting another go. But seeing the official words still made her feel like the floor had just been pulled out from under her feet. 2 days later, the landlord called directly. He was a middle-aged man who wasn't a bad person, just simply facing difficulties like so many others. He said frankly that he couldn't wait any longer because the bank was also pressuring him. "I know you've been trying, Lena," he said over the phone, "but I have a loan to pay too." Lena didn't blame him. That even made her feel more desperate. It would have been so much easier if there was someone to blame. But the truth was, there was no villain here, just people trying to survive in their own way. After that call, Lena almost disappeared from normal life. She started driving more than ever since the day Daniel died. There were days she left the apartment at 5 in the morning and only returned after midnight. There were days she slept less than 3 hours and then opened the rideshare app again. Sophia began to get used to doing homework in the back seat of the car, eating dinner with sandwiches bought at the gas station, and falling asleep under a blanket while her mother took a few last rides. Lena promised herself that this was only temporary. She just needed to earn enough to cover the missing amount. Just needed to keep the apartment. Just needed Sophia not to have to change schools. But the human body always has limits. One afternoon, Lena woke up in the parking garage of a supermarket on the west side of the city, and it took her a few seconds to remember where she was. She had fallen asleep between 2 rides, with the phone still in her hand. Another time, she startled awake because of a car horn behind her while stopped at a red light. Headaches began to appear more frequently. Both of her wrists ached from constant driving. Her always burned as if there was sand inside. But despite everything, there was one thing Lena never skipped. Evelyn Whitmore's Thursday morning chemotherapy rides. No matter how short on money she was, no matter how high the surge pricing was downtown, every Thursday morning she still showed up on time in front of the cancer treatment center. That habit had become something that went far beyond ordinary duty. Evelyn quickly noticed the change in her. The dark circles under her eyes became more obvious. Her smile appeared less often. and sometimes Lena would take a few seconds to respond when someone called her name. "You're working too much," Evelyn said once when they were stuck in traffic near Grant Park. Lena just smiled and shook her head. "I'm fine." That was the answer she used with everyone, with customers, with neighbors, with herself. But Evelyn didn't completely believe it. She had lived long enough to recognize when someone was struggling to hold life together. Even so, she didn't press Lena to say more. Partly because she understood that sometimes pride was the last thing people had left when everything else started to collapse. Meanwhile, Sophia began to sense the tension even though no one told her directly. One evening, while Lena was in the kitchen talking on the phone with the landlord, Sophia accidentally overheard a few words through the slightly open door. "Just one more week. Please, I'm trying." The next day, on the way to school, Sophia sat silently for a long time and then suddenly asked if they had to move somewhere else. Lena felt her heart stop for a moment. She immediately asked why the little girl thought that. Sophia looked down at her old shoes and said softly that she didn't want to leave school, didn't want to lose her friends, and didn't want to leave the room with the stars stuck on the ceiling that her dad had helped her put up many years ago. Lena had to turn her face away for a few seconds so Sophia wouldn't see her eyes turning red. She promised that everything would be okay, even though she herself was no longer sure of that. Then one other night, when the clock was close to 3 in the morning, Lena parked the car on the side of a quiet road near an industrial area in South Chicago. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was still blowing hard through the dark warehouses. On her phone was an account balanced less than what she needed to keep the apartment. In the back seat was the blanket Sophia usually used when sleeping. In that moment, all the exhaustion Lena had been suppressing for many months finally broke. She bent her head down onto the steering wheel and cried in her dark car, not loud crying, just the quiet tears of a person who was too tired to keep being strong. She sat like that for a few minutes, alone in the freezing night of Chicago, until her phone rang with a new ride notification. Lena wiped her face with her sleeve, took a deep breath, started the old Camry, and drove back into the night as if life had never allowed her to stop for long. Winter in Chicago seemed to drag on endlessly, and the weeks that followed became the most difficult period since Lena Morales started taking Evelyn Whitmore to chemotherapy. That Thursday morning started like every other week, but ended in a way neither of them could forget. Evelyn's chemotherapy session lasted longer than usual because the doctors had to adjust the medication after test results showed her body reacting increasingly poorly to the treatment. Lena had parked in the garage before 9 in the morning and sat waiting. On her phone, surge pricing notifications kept appearing. Downtown Chicago was hosting a large conference, customer volume had spiked, and other drivers were making a lot of money. Just by taking a few rides around the loop, Lena could earn enough for this month's electricity bill. But every time she thought about leaving, she remembered the image of Evelyn stepping out of the treatment center exhausted and having to stand alone in the cold. So she kept waiting. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Sophia had finished her homework, taken a short nap, and woken up again. Lena ate half a sandwich bought at the gas station that morning and drank cold coffee to stay awake. Near 3 in the afternoon, the door of the treatment center finally opened. Evelyn appeared slower than usual. She walked as if every step required all the remaining strength in her body. Her face was so pale it almost blended with the snow outside. When Lena ran over to help, Evelyn only nodded slightly in greeting. She was too tired to talk. On the way from the hospital door to the car, she had to stop twice to catch her breath. When she finally sat in the passenger seat, Evelyn closed her eyes immediately. Lena didn't turn on music. She just started the car and quietly drove out of the garage. For the first nearly 10 minutes, no one said a word. There was only the familiar rattling sound of the old heater and the sound of the tires crunching over the dirty snow on the roadside. Then at a red light near Grant Park, Evelyn slowly opened her eyes. She looked at Lena for a long time. So long that Lena started to feel awkward. "Has anyone ever asked you how you're living?" Evelyn suddenly spoke. The question was so simple that Lena thought she had misheard. "What do you mean?" she asked back. Evelyn looked at the dark circles under her eyes, her pale skin from lack of sleep, and her thin hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I notice people always ask me how I feel. Doctors ask, nurses ask, my son asks, but I've never heard anyone ask you that." Lena laughed reflexively. It was the kind of laugh she used whenever she wanted to hide something. "I'm fine." But this time the answer sounded so weak that even she didn't believe it. The car continued rolling for a few seconds in silence, and then something inside Lena suddenly broke. Maybe because she was too tired. Maybe because it had been too long since anyone had truly seen her. Or maybe because the old woman sitting next to her was asking with a sincerity she couldn't remember the last time she received. Lena tried to hold to her smile, but the tears still welled up. She immediately turned her face away as if ashamed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what's happening anymore." Evelyn didn't say anything. She just waited. And for the first time in many years, Lena began to talk. She talked about Daniel, about the day her husband died at the construction site, about the bills that never stopped coming, about the nights sleeping in the car because she had to work too much, about the fear of losing the apartment, about how she always tried to act okay because Sophia needed a strong mother. Finally, Lena said something she had never admitted to anyone. "Since Daniel died," she said while still looking forward, "no one has really asked if I'm okay. Except Sophia." That sentence hung in the air like something too true to take back. Evelyn looked at her for a very long time, then slowly placed her thin hand on Lena's shoulder. Not a polite touch between acquaintances, but the touch of a mother. No advice, no empty words of encouragement, just a hand there. And in some way, that meant more than anything else. Lena suddenly realized it had been so long since anyone had taken care of her emotions. People needed her to be a mother, needed her to be a driver, needed her to be strong, needed her to keep going. But very few people remembered that she was also a person who was tired, scared, and sometimes just wanted someone to ask if she was okay today. When the old Camry continued rolling along Lakeshore Drive under the gray winter sky, something between them had changed. Evelyn was no longer just a passenger. Lena was no longer just a driver. The invisible boundary that had existed for months began to disappear. And for the first time since they met, both understood that they were not only helping each other through chemotherapy sessions, they were helping each other get through loneliness. The conversation in the old Camry that day not only changed the relationship between Lena and Evelyn, it also accidentally marked the moment when Evelyn Whitmore began to step into a truth he had not seen for many months. Everything started one late evening when Adrian sat alone in his office on the top floor of Whitmore Dynamics after most employees had gone home. The large screens still displayed real-time shipping charts and logistics data from across America, but for the first time in many years, Adrian couldn't focus on work. The image of his mother appeared in his mind more than the numbers, especially the question that still had no answer. Why did Evelyn keep refusing a private chauffeur to use rideshares? That uncomfortable feeling finally made Adrian do something he had never thought he would do. He called the management office of the condo building where his mother lived and requested access to the security camera system around the garage and main lobby. At first, Adrian only wanted to confirm that his mother was still safe. But the more he watched, the more he realized he was seeing a completely different story. On the camera screen, week after week, an old silver Toyota Camry appeared at the exact same times. Adrian saw a young woman get out of the car in the snow, walk around to the passenger side, and open the door for his mother. There were rainy days. There were days when the wind was so cold that pedestrians had to walk with their heads down. But that woman always got out first, always stood next to Evelyn, always waited until she entered the building safely before returning to the car. Adrian fast-forwarded through a few more weeks. The image repeated. At first he thought it was just professional courtesy. But then he began to notice the small details. That woman often held his mother's elbow when she stepped out of the car. One time she even ran in the rain to get an umbrella from the trunk and held it for her. Another time, the camera recorded her bending down to pick up Evelyn's knitted scarf that had fallen and carefully wrapping it back around her neck before letting her into the lobby. Adrian watched those video clips many more times than he wanted to admit. What surprised him most was not the woman's actions, but his mother's reaction. In the past nearly year, Adrian had seen Evelyn sit with private nurses, meet doctors, and talk with the healthcare specialists he hired. She was always polite, always grateful, but rarely truly happy. Yet in those blurry camera clips, Evelyn was smiling. Not a social smile, but a real smile. One time, Adrian saw his mother sitting in the passenger seat, laughing so hard she had to cover her mouth with her hand. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her like that. The more he watched, the more a strange feeling rose in his chest. Not jealousy, not anger, but a kind of shame that was hard to name. He knew the name of every member of his company's board, knew the schedules of the executives, knew the thousands of employees working under him. But he didn't know who the woman who had appeared beside his mother for nearly a year was. The next morning, Adrian called Claire into his office. He asked her to look into the rideshare account that appeared regularly in Evelyn's payment history. Claire was quite surprised because it was the first time in many months that Adrian had proactively asked about his mother's daily life. "What do you want to know?" she asked. Adrian was silent for a few seconds before answering. "I want to know who has been by my mother's side all this time." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Lena Morales had no idea she was being mentioned in a luxurious office overlooking the entire Chicago skyline. She was sitting in the old Camry parked in a parking garage near the hospital, opening a discounted sandwich pack from the convenience store and splitting it with Sophia to save a few more dollars for the rent. On her phone was a list of unpaid bills. In her wallet was so little money that she had to calculate every gas fill-up. In the back seat was the blanket Sophia still used to sleep whenever her mother drove at night. Lena didn't know that one of the richest people in the city was trying to find out who she was. She only knew that in a few hours Evelyn would finish chemotherapy and shouldn't have to step out into the cold alone. At the same time, on the top floor of Whitmore Dynamics, Adrian looked down at the Chicago streets below, and for the first time realized how vast the gap was between his world and the world of the woman driving that silver Camry. One side had glass-walled conference rooms, billion-dollar contracts, and private flights. The other side had a single mother eating cold sandwiches in her car to save money to keep a roof over her daughter's head. And in some way Adrian couldn't yet understand, it was the woman in that other world who was bringing his mother more peace than everything his money had ever bought. Winter gradually passed, but Evelyn Whitmore's condition did not improve as everyone had hoped. On the contrary, week by week, chemotherapy seemed to take more things from her body. Not just strength, not just appetite or peaceful nights of sleep. It took away even the small parts of the person she once was. The treatment sessions lasted longer, the recovery days were slower, and the pauses between sentences grew longer than before. Lena began to notice this as soon as she saw Evelyn step out of the treatment center. Before, she still tried to keep her back straight, even when very tired. Now her shoulders often slumped, as if carrying an invisible weight. The navy blue knitted scarf also appeared more often. At first, Evelyn only wrapped it on cold days, but then she wore it even when the weather warmed up. One morning, when the March wind blew gently through downtown Chicago, Lena accidentally saw a patch of pale scalp under the knitted scarf when Evelyn bent down to get into the car. She had lost a lot more hair, a great deal. Evelyn immediately pulled the scarf back as if afraid of being seen, but Lena just continued, starting the car as if she hadn't noticed anything. She understood there were wounds that pride made people not want to be pitied for. The following weeks became more difficult for both of them. One afternoon after chemotherapy, when they had left the hospital for less than 10 minutes, Evelyn suddenly asked Lena to stop the car. Her voice was so weak it was almost inaudible. Lena had just pulled into an old snow-covered parking lot next to an abandoned warehouse when Evelyn doubled over from a severe wave of nausea. This time, everything was much worse than before. She vomited until she couldn't breathe, both hands gripping the edge of the seat while her whole body shook from pain and exhaustion. The cold winds from the lake blew across the empty lot, making the car frame tremble slightly. Lena turned off the engine and sat down next to Evelyn instead of returning to the driver's seat. She held the vomit bag for her, gave her water when she needed it, and waited. Simply waited. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Then more than 40 minutes passed. Lena's phone kept ringing with new ride notifications. She didn't look at it once. Someone else would take those rides. But at that moment, Evelyn only had her. Finally, when the nausea eased a little, Evelyn leaned her head against the seat and looked at Lena with eyes red from exhaustion. "Why do you still do this?" she asked very softly. "Why do you still take care of me when your life is even harder than mine?" Lena was silent for a few seconds. Outside the window, patches of old snow were slowly melting under the faint end-of-day sunlight. She couldn't remember how long it had been since anyone had asked her that. "I've thought a lot about that," Lena said. "Maybe because I owe someone." Evelyn frowned slightly. Lena looked into the distance and began to talk about the final days of Daniel. She told about the cold hospital room at Cook County Hospital, about the long nights when doctors were no longer sure her husband would make it, about the feeling of helplessness watching the person she loved in pain and being unable to do anything. Then she told about a nurse, a woman whose name she couldn't even remember anymore. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep because of the pain. Lena had also been awake for nearly 2 days straight. Around 3 in the morning, she collapsed onto the chair in the hospital room. When she woke up, she saw that nurse sitting by Daniel's bed, not because it was her duty, not because anyone asked. She was just sitting there, talking to him, giving him water, and telling Lena to sleep a little more. She stayed for nearly 3 hours, Lena said softly. No one paid her extra. No one asked her to do it. She just didn't want a scared man to be alone. Evelyn listened quietly. Daniel died a few days later, Lena continued. But I've never forgotten that night. Never forgotten that a stranger spent time with us when she could have been doing so many other things. Lena turned to look at Evelyn and smiled tiredly. Maybe from then on I always thought that if I had the chance, I should do the same for others. In that moment, Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She understood that what Lena was doing wasn't random sacrifice. It was kindness passed from one person to another, a small flame kept alive through many years instead of being allowed to go out. That nurse back then had given Lena kindness, and now Lena was passing it on to her. Evelyn lowered her head for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were red. I'm afraid of dying, she said for the first time since they had known each other. Then she shook her head very lightly. No, actually I'm more afraid of dying alone. That sentence hung in the quiet space of the car like a truth she had hidden for too long. Not cancer, not pain, not the long chemotherapy sessions. What she feared most was one day disappearing from the world in loneliness. Lena didn't say anything. She only placed her hand on the back of Evelyn's thin hand. The two sat like that for a few more minutes before Lena started the car again. On the way home, she drove very slowly along Lakeshore Drive. Lake Michigan stretched out under the silvery gray afternoon light while the distant buildings gradually lit up. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat with the navy blue knitted scarf wrapped around her head. Before long, she fell asleep from exhaustion. Lena glanced over and slowed down a little more. In the old Camry rolling through city, no one said another word. There was only the steady sound of the engine, the familiar rattling of the heater, and an old woman who finally got to sleep after many hours of pain. In the weeks that followed, Lena began to get used to every one of Evelyn's chemotherapy sessions being harder than the last. But nothing prepared her for what happened on a Thursday afternoon at the end of March. That day the weather was unusually more pleasant after many months of long winter. The snow had almost completely melted from the curbs and faint streaks of sunlight reflected on the glass of the downtown Chicago buildings. Lena waited in the parking garage as usual, the old Camry parked in its familiar spot near the patient exit. Sophia sat in the back doing math homework while Lena checked her phone and tried to calculate how much money she was still short to pay the overdue rent. Near 3 in the afternoon, the door of the treatment center opened. Evelyn appeared with a young nurse. As soon as she saw her, Lena immediately knew something was wrong. Evelyn walked much slower than usual. Her face was white as paper. Even the weak smile she tried to give Lena disappeared almost immediately. Lena walked quickly over to support her. Is today really bad? She asked gently. Evelyn tried to answer, but before she could open her mouth, her legs gave out. Everything happened in less than 2 seconds. Her body fell forward like a puppet with its strings cut. Lena barely managed to catch her shoulders before her head hit the cold concrete floor of the parking garage. Evelyn, she shouted. Sophia ran out of the car in panic. The nurse immediately called for help. Just a few minutes later, the sound of ambulance sirens echoed throughout the parking level. Lena sat beside her holding Evelyn's hand while medical staff checked her vital signs. She didn't respond. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't say anything. She just lay motionless under the cold fluorescent lights. When the ambulance arrived, a staff member asked Lena if she was family. No, Lena answered reflexively, then looked at Evelyn. But I will go with her. It wasn't a rational decision. Her night shift had already started. Every hour sitting in the hospital was an hour she lost money, and at that moment she needed every dollar to keep the apartment for Sophia. But Lena still climbed into the ambulance with Evelyn without thinking further. They arrived at the emergency room of Northwestern Memorial Hospital as the sky began to darken. The following hours passed under cold white lights, loudspeaker announcements, and the familiar smell of antiseptic. Sophia slept curled up on 2 plastic chairs in the waiting room, with her jacket as a blanket. Occasionally, the little girl would startle awake and ask if Evelyn was okay yet. Lena always answered that she would be okay, even though she herself wasn't sure. The clock on the wall kept running. 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. Lena's phone kept ringing with ride notifications and unpaid bills. She looked at them and put the phone away again. Every minute she stayed here made her financial situation worse. But the thought of leaving while Evelyn hadn't woken up yet made her unable to stand up. Near midnight, an urgent call was made to Boston. Evelyn Whitmore had just finished dinner with a group of investor partners and was preparing to return to his hotel when he received the news that his mother had been hospitalized. Less than 2 hours later, the car from O'Hare Airport sped through the quiet streets of Chicago in the night. Adrian arrived at the hospital around 1 in the morning. When he walked into the treatment area, he immediately looked for his mother. But before seeing Evelyn, he accidentally saw another scene. A young woman was carefully taking off her jacket and covering his mother with it while she was still unconscious on the hospital bed. The faded old jacket, worn-down shoes, and face tired from lack of sleep were completely out of place in the modern private hospital setting around them. Adrian only glanced briefly before focusing on his mother. He didn't know who that woman was, but that image stayed somewhere in his mind. A while later, during the conversation with the nurse on duty, Adrian asked who had brought his mother to the hospital. The nurse looked over his shoulder and pointed toward the waiting room. That woman over there. Adrian was surprised. Are they relatives of my mother? The nurse shook her head. No, as far as I know, they're not. Adrian looked in the direction she pointed. Lena was sitting next to Sophia, her head leaning against the wall, her eyes red from exhaustion. She's been here since the ambulance arrived, the nurse continued. All night. Adrian didn't know how to react. A stranger had stayed by his mother's side for many hours, while he had to fly in from another state to be there. That thought made him uncomfortable in a very strange way. Near 2 in the morning, Evelyn finally woke up. The doctor immediately came to check. Adrian walked over to the hospital bed. Mom. He leaned down. I'm here now. Evelyn blinked a few times as if trying to regain her bearings. Then the first thing she asked was not about the test results, not about her condition, not about her son. Where's Lena? The entire room was silent for a few seconds. Adrian turned his head to look toward the glass door. Lena was sleeping slumped over on a plastic chair in the hallway with Sophia curled up beside her. In that moment, a strange feeling rose in his chest. Not jealousy, not anger, but the painful realization that a very large part of his mother's real life was happening outside his view. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Whitmore felt that he was not the person who understood his mother the most. He was just the person who paid the bills. After the night in the emergency room, Adrian Whitmore could not return to normal life as before. He still attended meetings, he still signed contracts, he still appeared on calls with investors. But somewhere in his mind, the image of the woman in the old jacket covering his mother with it in the middle of the night still wouldn't disappear. It was like a question without an answer that Adrian could no longer ignore. A few days after Evelyn was discharged, he asked the condo management to send all the security footage related to his mother's trips over the past many months. He also requested access to the hospital camera clips that the administration agreed to provide. At first, Adrian only intended to watch a few minutes, but then he sat in his office until late at night, going from one video clip to another, like a person reading for the first time a book about his own mother's life. On the screen, Lena Morales appeared again and again. There were cold, rainy days. There were days when snow covered the walkway white. There were days when the wind was so strong that her cheap jacket flapped behind her back. But every time, she got out first. She walked around to open the door. She held out her hand to support Evelyn with every small step, as if she were family. Adrian saw scenes of his mother stepping out of the car with trembling legs after chemotherapy, while Lena patiently walked slowly with every step without rushing. He saw the harsh winter days when snow covered the ground thickly, and Lena almost used her whole body to shield Evelyn from the wind on the short path from the car to the condo lobby. In another clip, Adrian saw his mother stop in the middle of the walkway because she was too tired. Lena didn't show any impatience. She just stood beside her, said something that made Evelyn laugh, and then continued walking. Adrian fast-forwarded. A camera in the hospital parking garage recorded the scene of Evelyn vomiting after chemotherapy. He saw Lena take a towel from the trunk and kneel down to clean the back seat. Not once, many times. Without discomfort, without an annoyed shake of the head. Just the calm patience of a person who accepted that illness sometimes made people lose the things they most wanted to keep. Autonomy and dignity. Adrian paused the video there for a long time. He thought about the luxury cars he had once hired for his mother, the most expensive care services, the people who were always paid to be polite. But he had never seen anyone take care of Evelyn this way. Then he continued watching. Another clip made him sit still. It was the parking garage of the treatment center. Lena parked in a far corner and sat waiting 1 hour, 2 hours. There were days nearly 4 hours. In the back seat, a little girl slept curled up under an old blanket. Adrian realized that was Sophia, Lena's daughter. He watched the scene of the child dozing in the car while her mother waited for a cancer patient to finish treatment. Then he watched Lena eat a cheap sandwich from the convenience store, drink cold coffee, and continue waiting. Not once, week after week, a heavy feeling began to spread in his chest. But what shocked Adrian the most was in the trip data that Claire finally collected. After checking dozens of rideshare bills, they discovered that Lena often did not end the trip immediately upon arrival. There were times she let the app continue running for a few more minutes and then adjusted it herself. There were times she didn't charge for waiting at all, even when Evelyn was in the treatment center longer than expected. It took Adrian a moment to understand what that meant. This woman was not only giving her time, she was voluntarily giving up part of her already meager income so his mother wouldn't have to pay extra. And that happened while she herself was facing the risk of losing her home. Adrian leaned back in his chair and watched the screen gradually darken in front of him. Nearly a year. For nearly a year, this woman had quietly appeared in Evelyn's life without receiving anything significant in return. No fame, no money, no benefits. Simply because she didn't want an old person to have to fight illness alone. In that moment, Adrian unconsciously remembered all the times he had sent flowers to his mother on Mother's Day. The birthday gifts chosen by his assistant. The rushed calls from the airport. The handwritten cards signed between meetings. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure his mother had the best of everything. But he couldn't remember the last time he had actually sat with her for hours just to talk. Couldn't remember the last time he had taken her to a doctor's appointment. Couldn't remember the last time he had stayed long enough to know what she was afraid of. Adrian had always thought money could solve every problem if used correctly. That was the philosophy that had helped him build an entire business empire. But that evening, sitting alone in his office looking down at the endless lights of Chicago, for the first time he felt his money was small to the point of embarrassment. It could buy medicine, buy hospitals, buy services, buy comfort, but it could not buy the hours Lena sat in the freezing parking lot just to wait for his mother to come out of the treatment center. It could not buy the way she cleaned the car seat after every time Evelyn vomited from the medication. And it certainly could not buy the reason his mother smiled more in that old Toyota Camry than anywhere else in the world. What Adrian Whitmore saw in those footage clips did not leave his mind for many days afterward. He tried to return to work, to strategy meetings and investor presentations, but every time the laptop screen turned off, he saw the image of Lena Morales standing in the snow supporting his mother with every small step. Finally, on a weekend afternoon, when Evelyn had somewhat recovered after her most recent hospitalization, Adrian decided to ask directly what he could no longer keep in his heart. He went to the condo in Gold Coast earlier than usual. No assistant accompanying him, no phone constantly ringing, just him and his mother sitting across from each other by the window, overlooking Lake Michigan, covered in the pale gray of early spring. Evelyn was halfway through knitting a small scarf for Sophia when Adrian suddenly spoke. "Why didn't Mom tell me about Lena?" The knitting needles in Evelyn's hands paused for a few seconds. She didn't look surprised. It was as if she had known this conversation would come sooner or later. "You already know?" she asked gently. Adrian nodded. "I watched the cameras. I watched the trips. I know she's the one who has been taking you back and forth all this time." Evelyn put the ball of yarn down on her lap and looked out at the lake for a long time before answering. "Because I didn't want to turn her kindness into a business transaction." Adrian frowned slightly. What do you mean? Evelyn smiled sadly. Do you know what the first thing you would do if you knew about this is? Adrian didn't answer, but both of them knew the answer. He would send money. He would pay her. He would find a way to compensate in the way he always solved every problem in his life. Evelyn turned to look at her son. Lena doesn't do those things for money, and I don't want anyone to make her feel like what she does can be valued with a check. Adrian was silent. Those words reminded him of the time Lena refused the envelope of money in the footage he had watched. Evelyn sighed very softly. Do you know what the strangest thing about getting old is? She asked. People stop seeing you as a person. Adrian looked up. Evelyn continued in a calm but tired voice. Most people look at me and only see two things, either Adrian Whitmore's mother or a cancer patient. She smiled bitterly. They no longer see Evelyn. The room fell into silence. Outside the window, small waves lapped against the distant shore. Doctors look at the medical record. Nurses look at the treatment schedule. Other people look at the family's assets. But very few people remember to ask what I'm thinking, what I'm afraid of, or what I'm remembering. Adrian looked down at his own hands. He couldn't argue, because deep down, he knew he had done the same. Evelyn looked at him and said something Adrian would remember for the rest of his life. Lena is the first person in a very long time who makes me feel like I'm still Evelyn. Adrian looked up. There was no blame in his mother's eyes. That hurt even more. When sitting in the car with her, I'm not a patient, not the mother of a billionaire, just an old woman talking about books, about the weather, and about life. She laughed lightly. She even argued with me about the book To Kill a Mockingbird. Adrian unconsciously smiled along, but that smile quickly disappeared when Evelyn continued. You know, there are days when I feel lonely even here. She looked around the large condo. In this apartment full of staff, Adrian felt his throat tighten. He had once been proud of giving his mother the most comfortable life possible. But now she was saying that sometimes this place was still lonely to the point of being terrifying. I always thought if Mom had everything, Mom would be okay, he said softly. Evelyn nodded. I know. Then she placed her hand on her son's hand. And I know you love me. That was what hurt Adrian the most. Because she had never doubted his love. The problem wasn't love, it was presence.
The rides with Lena.
Evelyn paused for a few seconds. Are the only time in the week I don't feel like I'm waiting to die. That sentence left Adrian completely speechless. He remembered all the expensive care services, the top specialists, the luxurious hospital rooms, all the things he had paid for in hopes of helping his mother live better. But in the end, what gave her the feeling of being alive again was conversations in an old Toyota Camry with a single mother struggling to pay rent. In that moment, Adrian began to understand something he had never learned in business his whole life. Genuine presence is worth more than any expensive service. A real person by your side when you're in pain can do what money can never do. The conversation ended when the sky had grown dark. Adrian left the condo and drove back to the company headquarters, not because there was still work to do, just because he wasn't ready to go home. Near midnight, he sat alone in the glass office on the top floor of Whitmore Dynamics. Chicago stretched out below like an endless sea of lights. For many years, Adrian had always known how to fix every problem. If a department wasn't performing efficiently, he changed it. If a company was in crisis, he found a solution. If someone needed help, he wrote a check. But for the first time in his life, Adrian Whitmore sat looking at the city below without knowing what he needed to fix. Because what was missing in his mother's life wasn't money, and he began to fear that there were things that could not be regained just by paying a higher price. After the conversation with his mother, Adrian Whitmore could no longer sit in his office and think of Lena Morales as just a name in payment data or a face appearing on security camera footage. He needed to meet her, not through an assistant, not through lawyers or the HR department, but directly. In the many years running Whitmore Dynamics, Adrian had become used to solving every problem with a meeting, a contract, or an appropriate payment. But this time, he had the feeling that if he assigned the task to someone else, he would miss the most important thing. So, on a Thursday afternoon a few weeks later, Adrian drove himself to the cancer treatment center where his mother still received chemotherapy every week. He arrived nearly an hour early and parked in a far corner of the parking garage. Part of him felt that what he was doing was truly strange. He had once negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars without any anxiety. But now, Just the thought of meeting that woman made him feel restless. While Evelyn was still in the treatment room, Adrian saw the familiar silver Toyota Camry parked near the exit. The car looked even older than what he had imagined from the camera footage. One side of the front bumper had a long scratch. The paint had faded in many places. The heater was probably still making that rattling sound like his mother had once described. Inside the car, Sophia was doing homework in the back seat, while Lena sat in the driver's seat with a paper coffee cup that had gone cold long ago. Nothing about the scene resembled Adrian's world, but that was exactly why he couldn't look away. Near 3 in the afternoon, when Evelyn finished chemotherapy and was escorted out by a nurse, Adrian decided to step forward. Lena was opening the car door for Evelyn as usual. When she saw the man in the expensive cashmere coat approaching, she simply thought he was another executive picking up a family member from the hospital. People like that appeared here quite often. "Excuse me," Adrian said. Lena turned around. "Can I talk to you for a few minutes?" She was a bit surprised but still nodded after making sure Evelyn was settled in the car. Adrian looked at the woman in front of him. There was nothing special about her by ordinary standards. The old jacket, dark circles under her eyes, 2 rough hands from working too much. But in some way, he knew this was the person who had changed the final months of his mother's life. "I'm Adrian Whitmore," he said. It took Lena a few seconds to recognize the name. When she did, she was so surprised she almost laughed. Then she turned to look at Evelyn sitting in the car. Everything suddenly connected. The condo in Gold Coast. The short calls between business trips. Evelyn's unusual secrecy. "Oh," Lena said softly. "Now I understand why she never wanted to talk much about her family." Adrian smiled very lightly. "My mother has always been good at keeping secrets." Then his expression became more serious. "I want to thank you." Lena looked a little awkward. "You don't need to." "Yes." Adrian shook his head. "I do." He looked straight into her eyes. "I've seen everything, the rides, the times you waited for hours, the times you stayed at the hospital, the times you took care of my mother." Lena lowered her head to look at the concrete floor of the parking garage. She had never thought anyone would notice the things she did. "My mother talks about you a lot," Adrian continued, "and I don't think just saying thank you is enough." He took a white envelope from inside his coat. There was no need to look to know what was inside. "I want you to accept this." Lena didn't take it. Adrian moved the envelope a little closer. "It's not charity. I know. It's not pity. I know. It's gratitude." Lena looked at the envelope for a few seconds and then looked at Adrian. "Do you know why your mother liked riding with me?" she asked. Adrian was slightly surprised. "I think I'm starting to understand." Lena shook her head very lightly. "Not because I drive better than your drivers. Not because my Camry is more comfortable. And definitely not because I can take care of her better than the medical team you hired." Adrian listened in silence. "Your mother needed someone by her side," Lena said slowly. "Not another service." Those words left Adrian speechless. Lena looked at the envelope in his hand and gently pushed it back. "If I accept that money, everything will become exactly what she was afraid of." "What do you mean?" Adrian asked. "A transaction," Lena replied. "A business transaction." Adrian recognized that was the exact phrase his mother had used. "I didn't help her for money," Lena continued. "I helped because no one should have to go to chemotherapy alone." There was no anger in her voice, no self-righteousness. Just a simple truth spoken, as if it was so obvious there was no need to argue. Adrian slowly lowered the envelope. In his entire life, he had met many people who refused money because they wanted more, wanted a bigger contract, wanted a better deal. But this was the first time someone had refused a large sum of money simply because it didn't fit with why they did what they did. "You know," Lena said after a moment of silence, "old people aren't as afraid of illness as people think." Adrian looked at her. "They're afraid of feeling like they're bothering others." Those words struck something deep inside him. He remembered all the times his mother had apologized just for needing help. The times she said she didn't want to trouble the private driver, didn't want to trouble the nurses, didn't want to trouble him. And he suddenly realized the woman standing in front of him understood his mother's greatest fear better than he did. The man who owned billions of dollars, who could hire any expert in the world, did not understand his mother, as well as a single mother struggling to pay rent. The conversation ended not long after that. Lena opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat as usual. Evelyn looked through the window, seeming to understand what had just happened without needing any explanation. Adrian stood in the middle of the parking garage as the old Camry started. Sophia waved from the back seat. Lena nodded slightly in farewell and drove away. Adrian watched the car grow smaller between the concrete pillars until it disappeared from sight. He stood there for a very long time, even after the sound of the engine had completely faded, feeling for the first time in his life that he had just learned something no business school, no leadership book, and no amount of money could teach. After the meeting between Adrian and Lena, everything seemed quieter on the surface, but beneath that quiet was a truth none of them could change. Evelyn Whitmore was weakening very quickly. Short hospital stays began to appear more frequently. There were weeks when she had to go to the hospital twice, just for severe dehydration after chemotherapy. One time Lena came to pick her up and was told that Evelyn was still being monitored in the emergency room and might need to wait a few more hours. Each time, Lena still waited, not out of duty, just because she couldn't imagine the old woman stepping out of the hospital without seeing someone familiar waiting for her. Adrian also began to appear more often. He tried to rearrange his schedule, cancel some business trips, and spend more time with his mother. Evelyn noticed this, and she was truly grateful. But even when her son had changed, there were fears she could only share with Lena. One April afternoon, rain fell continuously on the streets of Chicago. Not a heavy downpour, but a cold, persistent rain that covered the entire city in a sad gray. That day, chemotherapy left Evelyn so exhausted she almost didn't want to go home. After getting in the car, she just sat quietly, watching the raindrops streak down the window, while Lena drove very slowly through the crowded streets. Sophia was at the school library, so there were only the two of them in the car. After nearly 10 minutes of silence, Evelyn suddenly spoke. "I'm not afraid of dying anymore." Lena turned her head slightly to look at her and then looked back at the road ahead. She didn't interrupt. "It's true," Evelyn continued. "I've had nearly 80 years. I loved a wonderful man. I raised a son I'm proud of. I taught thousands of students. I'm not afraid of death anymore." Her voice was so calm it made the words sound even sadder. "So what are you afraid of?" Lena asked softly. Evelyn looked at her own hands. Her fingers had become much thinner in recent months. "I'm afraid of becoming someone everyone takes care of just because they feel responsible for doing so." Outside, the rain continued to tap lightly on the windshield. "I'm afraid of people being by my side out of obligation, out of work, out of schedule, because they feel they should." She smiled sadly. "I think that's the scariest thing about getting old." Lena didn't say anything. She just continued driving and listening. Evelyn talked about the years after her husband passed away. At first, friends still visited regularly. Old colleagues still called. Adrian still tried to make time for his mother. But then year after year, everyone got busier. Some people moved away. Some passed away. The calls became less frequent. The dinner invitations became fewer. The meetings were canceled because of busy schedules. "I started to feel like I was just an appointment in someone else's calendar," she said. "A call that needed to be made, a visit that needed to be scheduled, a responsibility that needed to be fulfilled." Lena felt her throat tighten. She remembered her father in the nursing home. Remembered the look in his eyes every time the door opened, and then the disappointment when the person who walked in wasn't family. "But you never treated me like that," Evelyn continued. "You never looked at me like a patient." She turned to look at Lena. "You talked to me like a normal woman, about books, about Sophia, about the weather, about things that had nothing to do with cancer." Lena smiled faintly. "Maybe because you are a normal woman." Evelyn laughed, a small but genuine laugh. "Thank you for that." They sat in the car for a very long time after arriving in front of the condo. The rain continued to fall. No one was in a hurry to get out. No one mentioned the time. They just sat there like two old friends, sharing a sad afternoon. When Evelyn finally stepped out of the car, Sophia had just been picked up by Lena from the library on the way back. The little girl saw her and immediately ran over to hug her tightly as usual. "I missed you, Miss Evelyn." Just a simple sentence like that, but Evelyn suddenly froze. She hugged Sophia for a very long time, longer than ever before, and then tears began to roll down her cheeks. Sophia looked up in surprise. "What's wrong?" Evelyn just shook her head and kissed the little girl's hair lightly. "It's okay, sweetheart." But Lena knew what she was crying for. There are times when people don't cry because of pain. They cry because they are loved in a way they thought they would never receive again. That evening, after returning to her quiet condo, Evelyn sat for a very long time by the window. looking at the lights reflecting on Lake Michigan. On the table was the drawing Sophia had once made. Next to it were a few small photos she had taken with Lena and Sophia over the past months. After a long while, she opened the desk drawer and took out an old set of stationery. She put on her glasses, picked up a pen, and began writing the first lines. Not to Adrian, not to the lawyer or the doctor, but to Lena Morales. A secret letter she was not yet ready for anyone to read. A letter she hoped would only be opened at the right time. And in the soft golden light of the apartment, Evelyn Whitmore continued writing each line slowly, as if trying to put into it everything she might one day no longer have the chance to say out loud. Spring began to appear on the streets of Chicago, with the first patches of green grass revealed after the melting snow, and days that were a little longer after many months of gray skies. While Evelyn Whitmore grew weaker, and her chemotherapy trips became the center of her life, another change was also quietly taking place in a completely different part of the city. Adrian Whitmore began to change, not the kind of sudden change people notice overnight. It happened slowly, almost silently, like the way winter finally gave way to spring. After meeting Lena in the hospital parking garage, Adrian couldn't forget what she had said, especially the part about old people fearing the feeling of bothering others more than the illness itself. In the many weeks that followed, he spent time reading reports he had never cared about before. Not profit reports, not transportation or artificial intelligence data, but studies on cancer patients. The numbers stunned him. Thousands of chemotherapy patients in the Chicago area missed their sessions each year simply because they didn't have reliable transportation. Many elderly people living alone couldn't afford regular rides. Some had to choose between buying medicine and calling a car to the hospital. Low-income patients often canceled or delayed treatment because they couldn't find rides. Adrian read report after report over many consecutive nights. And for the first time, instead of thinking about how to optimize a business system, he began thinking about how to fix a human problem. One morning, Adrian called a meeting with the senior leadership team at Whitmore Dynamics. Everyone thought he was about to announce a new technology project. Instead, Adrian presented a plan to build a free transportation program for cancer patients across the Chicago area. The room was almost silent when he finished. A few people thought this was just a short-term charity activity. But Adrian didn't want a PR campaign. He wanted to create a system that actually worked, a system patients could trust. In the following months, his team began collaborating with hospitals, treatment centers, and nonprofit organizations in the city. Adrian personally participated in more meetings than anyone expected. He read every proposal, edited every small detail. And the more he learned, the more he realized that patients' difficulties didn't stop at the lack of rides. Many single parents missed treatment because they had no one to watch their children. Some had to bring small children and sit for hours in hospital waiting rooms. Others completely gave up their treatment schedules because they couldn't find childcare solutions. When he heard that, Adrian immediately thought of Sophia. He remembered the camera footage of the little girl dozing in the back seat of the old Camry, while her mother waited for Evelyn's chemotherapy. And so he requested adding a new category. At participating treatment centers, there would be childcare lounges for single parents, safe spaces with books, toys, study areas, and support staff so children would have somewhere to be while their parents received treatment. But what surprised many people the most was Adrian's next request. He didn't want drivers to be trained only in traffic safety or mobility assistance. He wanted them trained in emotional care. He requested building training courses to help drivers understand how to talk with cancer patients, how to help elderly people maintain their dignity, how to listen without judgment, and how to be present when someone simply needed someone by their side. One manager once asked why that was so important. Adrian was silent for a few seconds before answering that sometimes what saves a person is not the ride itself, but the feeling that they don't have to go the whole way alone. When the project was nearly complete, the communications team asked what he wanted to name the program. Adrian didn't need to think long. The Evelyn Ride Program, he said simply. No one in the room knew the full meaning of that name. They only thought it was his way of honoring his mother. And in a way, that was correct. But Adrian knew the truth was even bigger than that. This program wasn't born just because of Evelyn. It was born because of what he had learned from the old silver Camry parked outside the hospital parking garage for nearly a year. Even so, Adrian never told Lena that, He also didn't tell her that she was the one who had changed the way he saw the world, partly because he knew she wouldn't like it, partly because he understood there are kinds of kindness that don't need to be put on a plaque to have value. While the plans were being implemented across the city, Lina Morales continued her daily life. She still woke up before dawn. She still drove the old Camry through Chicago's crowded streets. She still picked up Evelyn every Thursday morning. She still shared sandwiches with Sophia on days when money was tight. She didn't know that in the luxurious conference rooms, where the most powerful people in the city gathered, her story had changed the way they thought. She didn't know that thousands of future patients would have transportation to the hospital thanks to lessons born from her simple kindness. And perhaps the most beautiful thing was that Lina didn't know, because she had never done anything to change the world. She had only tried to make sure that one old woman didn't have to step out of chemotherapy and feel completely alone. But sometimes the biggest changes begin from exactly those small actions. Autumn came to Chicago more slowly than usual, as if the city was also trying to stretch out a little more time before winter returned. The trees along Lakeshore Drive turned deep yellow, then deep red. Dry leaves rolled in the wind across the sidewalks, and Lake Michigan reflected the pale gray sky of the late October days. That was also when Lina Morales began to realize that Evelyn Whitmore was entering a different stage of the battle she had quietly endured for nearly a year. The chemotherapy sessions were no longer just hours-long challenges. They took away nearly all of her remaining strength. That Thursday morning, Lina parked in front of Evelyn's condo as usual, but it was nearly 10 minutes later before she appeared in the lobby. As soon as she saw her through the glass door, Lina felt her heart tighten. Evelyn looked smaller than ever. The familiar navy blue sweater now hung loosely on her noticeably thinner body. Her hand gripped the door frame tightly, as if just standing straight already used up too much energy. Lina immediately stepped out of the car. "Take it slow," she said softly. Evelyn smiled, but the smile was so fragile it made Lina want to turn her face away. The distance from the condo lobby to the car was only a few meters, but they took nearly 5 minutes to cover it. Lina supported her with every small step across the path covered in yellow leaves. In that moment, Evelyn no longer looked like a patient. She looked like a precious memory that people were afraid of dropping if they didn't hold it carefully enough. On the way to the treatment center, Evelyn barely said much. She just sat looking at the city passing by the window, the cafes along the street, the joggers by the lake, the children in school uniforms getting out of class. The ordinary things she hadn't noticed before, but now gazed at for a long time. After the chemotherapy session, when Lina brought her back, the sky had turned to the pale orange of late afternoon. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat with tired but strangely calm eyes. A while later, she spoke softly. "I'm not sure I have the strength for many more chemotherapy sessions." Lina felt her hands tighten on the steering wheel. She had known this day would come. She just had never been truly ready to hear it spoken out loud. "Don't think too far ahead," she said gently. Evelyn smiled. "You always say that." They both laughed, but the laughter quickly dissolved into the long silence that followed. When the car was nearly at Gold Coast, Evelyn suddenly opened her handbag and took out a small cream-colored envelope that was slightly wrinkled at the corners. She placed it on Lina's lap. "Take it home." Lina looked at the envelope and then at her. "What is it?" "Only open it when you get home." "Are you giving me money again?" Lina tried to joke. Evelyn laughed very softly. "No. And this time you're not allowed to return it." There was something in her voice that made Lina not ask any more questions. She only placed the envelope in the storage compartment in front of her and continued driving. When they arrived at the condo, Lina again helped Evelyn all the way to the door as usual. But that day, everything happened more slowly. Evelyn had to stop many times to catch her breath. At one point, she stood still in the middle of the hallway and looked at Lina for a very long time, as if wanting to memorize her face carefully. When they reached the apartment door, she hugged Lina for the first time since they had known each other. Not a social hug, but the hug of a person who knew they were about to say goodbye to something very important in their life. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered. Lina wanted to say something back, but her throat tightened. In the end, she only nodded. After the condo door closed, Lina walked back down to the garage, but instead of starting the engine right away like usual, she sat still behind the wheel. The sun had set. The city lights began to turn on outside the window. A strange feeling enveloped her, not a specific sadness, not fear. Just the feeling that a certain chapter in her life was quietly coming to an end. She sat like that for a very long time before driving back to the small apartment in back of the yards. That night, after Sophia had gone to sleep, Lena finally remembered the envelope Evelyn had given her. She sat at the old kitchen table and opened it. Inside there was no money. Only a photo and a handwritten letter in Evelyn's familiar handwriting. The photo had been taken a few months earlier. In the photo, Sophia was smiling brightly between Lena and Evelyn, in front of the old silver Camry. Lake Michigan sparkled in the background, and the wind was blowing Evelyn's navy blue knitted scarf on her shoulder. Lena held the photo for a very long time before opening the letter. Each line appeared under the pale yellow light of the kitchen. Evelyn wrote that she had once thought her final years would only consist of hospitals, medicine, and quiet rooms. She wrote that Lena had never made her feel like a burden, even on days when she herself couldn't stand herself. She wrote that every conversation in the old Camry made her remember who she had been before cancer entered her life. She thanked Sophia for treating her like family. And in the final lines, the handwriting began to shake a little more. Lena had to blink many times to continue reading. "If there is one thing I want you to believe," Evelyn wrote, "it is that your kindness has done what medicine could not. You never made me feel like I was waiting to die. You made me feel like I was still alive, even on the most painful days." Lena sat silently for a very long time after finishing. The letter still lay on the table. Outside the window, the last leaves of autumn were being swept away by the wind in a Chicago night that was gradually growing colder. 1 year later, winter returned to Chicago, with cold winds sweeping across Lake Michigan, as if the city had never known summer. Snow began to appear on the rooftops, on the bare trees along Lakeshore Drive, and on the parking lots outside cancer treatment centers across the city. But one thing had changed. In front of the chemotherapy centers that once had countless elderly patients sitting alone waiting for rides in the freezing cold, the cars bearing the symbol of the Evelyn Whitmore Foundation now appeared every day. They lined up along the curbs with drivers specially trained to assist cancer patients. Inside each car there were always warming blankets, salted crackers, water, and support materials for caregivers. At many treatment centers, new child care lounges also operated from early morning until evening, so single parents no longer had to choose between caring for their children and getting treatment for themselves. Thousands of free rides had been provided in the first year. Thousands of patients no longer had to miss chemotherapy because they lacked transportation. And most of them had no idea that it all started from an old Toyota Camry and the kindness of a woman who didn't have much to give besides her time and presence. Lena Morales still drove every Thursday morning as she had done for many years. Her life was now much more stable. After Evelyn's story became known within the family and the charity foundation, Adrian had helped pay off all the overdue rent through a community support program without ever attaching his name to it. Lena was later invited to participate in driver training for the Evelyn Ride program because no one understood patients better than she did. But Lena still kept her weekly driving schedule, not because she needed the money like before, but because she didn't want to forget the feeling of the days that had changed her life. Sophia was now older. The little girl no longer fell asleep in the back seat every morning like before. Instead, Sophie often sat in the front seat next to her mother with a small box of cookies and a bottle of water. Every time they met an elderly patient stepping out of the treatment center with a tired face, the little girl would smile and give them some cookies, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes Lena looked at her daughter and realized that kindness is like a flame. It is always passed from one person to another. A nurse who once sat by Daniel's side on his final night had passed it to Lena. Lena passed it to Evelyn. Evelyn passed it to Adrian. And now Sophia's was learning to pass it to complete strangers. Adrian Whitmore still ran Whitmore Dynamics and still appeared on CNBC, Forbes, and technology conferences as before. But those closest to him noticed he had changed. He spent more time with family. He canceled more business trips. He frequently visited treatment centers without prior notice. Occasionally on Thursday mornings, Adrian would stand at a distance far enough not to disturb anyone and quietly watch Lena work. He watched her help each patient into the car, watched her talk to them like normal people rather than people with illnesses, watched Sophia run over to give water to an old woman shaking from the cold, And every time Adrian thought of his mother, thought of the final months he had once believed only doctors and medicine mattered. One early winter morning, a new elderly woman joining the program stepped into Lena's car. She was over 70 years old, her head wrapped in a knitted scarf, like so many other chemotherapy patients. When she sat in the passenger seat, she looked at Lena and asked with a curious voice, "Do you work for the hospital?" Lena paused for a second and then laughed. That was the question Evelyn had once asked her in a different way many months before. Lena shook her head. "No." "Then why do you do this?" the old woman asked. Lena looked at the snow-covered road ahead and smiled very softly. "Because I don't believe anyone should have to go to chemotherapy alone." The old woman didn't say anything more. She only turned to look out the window while the corners of her eyes turned slightly red. Sophia sat beside her and quietly handed her a pack of salted crackers. On the dashboard of the Camry, the neatly folded navy blue knitted scarf was still there. Lena had never put it away. It was the scarf Evelyn had once left in the car during one of her final chemotherapy sessions. Adrian had once offered to return it to the family, but Lena asked to keep it. Not as a sad memento, but as a reminder that one person can change another person's life simply by showing up at the right time and staying long enough. Many months after Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep at the condo overlooking Lake Michigan, Adrian finally understood what he had taken nearly his whole life to learn. What saved his mother in her final year was not just medicine, not just good doctors or expensive medical bills. What saved her was the feeling of still being seen, still being listened to, still being loved by the genuine presence of another person. That was something money could not buy. And it was also something he had almost lost before it was too late. That afternoon, Lena finished her last ride of the day and drove along Lakeshore Drive like she had done hundreds of times before. Sophia sat in the front seat telling her mother about school. The navy blue knitted scarf lay quietly on the dashboard. Outside the window, the dark surface of Lake Michigan stretched out under the winter sky. The first snowflakes began to fall onto the cold water and disappeared in silence. The old Camry slowly rolled through the crowded traffic of Chicago, carrying the small warmth of people who had once found each other during the most difficult days. And somewhere far away, between the white snow and the vast lake, Evelyn Whitmore's story continued to live on in every ride, every conversation, and every act of kindness that one person gave to another without asking for anything in return. If this story has touched your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss inspiring stories about kindness, compassion, and the miracles that still exist in everyday life. Thank you for spending time with us today. We wish you peace and look forward to seeing you in the next story.